Hello, dear friends. Welcome. We've adapted to change, as our friend Darwin said, and that's why we've decided to do a different kind of BTI. Here, we're going to be introducing you to the biggest change in BTI Day, because what we're doing is broadcasting around the world. You're watching us from Japan, Russia, US, Italy, Spain, of course, you're in the four corners of the world. We've got over 100 different countries participating, and it's a true pleasure to have you here. We are broadcasting in 8 languages, but the slides you'll be watching in English because we thought that was the best way to help you. But let's start now. I haven't introduced myself. In Spain, you know who I am. I'm a magician, Magician More. I'm going to be here for the next couple of days with a lot of new information, some great content. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. And the first thing that we do normally in BTI Day is to start talking about something that has nothing to do with dentistry. So please allow me to just take a break from the world of dentistry and talk to you about something that we're going through at the moment. But I'm going to start by telling you a personal story. I always like starting with this sentence. I think it's very important to share success, but it's even more important to share failure because that's how we learn. But I want to share with you a personal story. This is my son, Marcos. He was born at 6.5 months and weighed 1.3 kilos. So he's probably the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Marcos developed something called periventricular leukomalacia. That meant part of his brain didn't develop. So he started suffering from epileptic fits. He then started suffering from the West syndrome. These are epileptic fits that affect children up to the age of 1, and they end up with brain paralysis. He's very handicapped at the moment. It's almost as if he's only 3 or 4 months old. He can't speak, he can't walk. He's like a baby. He's 15 now. But I have to say to you, Marcos is the happiest guy in the world, far happier than anybody else. I asked him about his tax return the other day, and he didn't give a damn. He doesn't send tax returns in. He doesn't worry if his football team loses either. He's a happy child. And I'm saying this because when Marcos was born, well, I was a magician like I am now, and I had no problems economically. But from this moment onwards, my life changed overnight. And I think it's very important, everything that I've learned via this experience, and that's what I'm trying to share with you this morning. So the question is, what have I learned from all of this? What is it that I'm trying to share with you today? Well, probably what you're going to see now is the most important lesson that I've ever learned in my life, which is what you're going to see now. You're not going to believe this. It is what it is. It is what it is. There is what there is, or it is what it is. And many of you are probably thinking, seriously? This guy's just saying this to me? It is what it is? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Well, this is a sentence actually that has taught me a lot because I realized right from the outset that you can't change things. You can't change facts. The only thing you can change is the way you face those facts or those events. I can't change the fact that my child is going to be disabled for the rest of his life, but I can change the way I see him and the way I face this problem. And I think something similar is happening with COVID at the moment. You can't change a world pandemic, but you can change your attitude and the way you face this pandemic. This is very important because you can apply this personally or professionally. I'm friends with a lady called Irene Villa. She suffered a terrorist attack. She's a very well-known lady in Spain, but she lost both her legs in this terrorist attack, and she'd always wanted to be a ballet dancer. When she lost both her legs, she suddenly said, well, what can I do without these two legs? So she decided to concentrate on what she could do from that moment onwards, instead of suffering for what she no longer could do. The same goes for all sorts of professions. There's a bank in Spain called Bankia had a terrible, terrible problem. The employees had their salaries reduced, and for 3 years they really were going through difficulties. against the headwind. I've got two neighbors who work at this bank. One of them met up with his boss and said, listen, boss, I'll do whatever is necessary. I'll change office, I'll change customers, I'll change sector if you want me to, whatever you need to progress. And the other was just suffering for 3 years. After 3 years, this situation got better. One had been suffering and the other had been fine, but the situation was the same for both of them. The same goes for COVID. We've seen companies who, within the same industry, have had greater or less success. Why? Well, partially to do with attitude. So when we talk about adapting, I do lots of live events. I can no longer participate in live events. So what have I been doing during the COVID pandemic? I've learned to play the piano. I've done a piano course over internet. If I hadn't radically changed or added to my professional skills, I wouldn't be happy economically or financially, but I saw the opportunity, so I launched myself in the deep end. The same goes for example, the tourist industry, or the travel industry. Here you've got Royal Caribbean that have organized cruises that can't go anywhere. So you get onto the cruise ship, you use all its facilities, the theatre, the pool, whatever you want. The cruise ship leaves the port and then returns to the port again. Well, lots of people are booking this because people just want to get on board a cruise ship, wherever it happens to be going, even if it's going nowhere. The same goes for Qantas, which is the Australian Airlines. What they're doing now is flights to nowhere. They leave the airport, they fly around Australia, and they return to the same airport they left from. People want to travel again. People want to get on board planes again, so they're flying nowhere. Those of you that live in Spain, that's no means original, because if you fly from Madrid to Bilbao, whenever there's turbulence or bad weather, you have to return to Madrid. So that's another example of a flight that goes nowhere. The same goes for Singapore Airlines. They've booked two of these huge airplanes, and they're booked out so that you can eat a Michelin star meal inside the airplane. So you can't fly, but at least you can have this experience inside a plane. Why? Why over 6,000 bookings in 24 hours? Well, because people want to know what it's like to fly first class, even though they're not going anywhere. Everybody's having a bad time in the hotel and catering industry now. But look at these. These are two Michelin-starred chefs in Spain, and what they've decided to do is to send food home. If you, before the pandemic, asked a Michelin-starred chef whether they were going to do home deliveries, they'd probably say, no, that's madness. But not only are they doing home deliveries, but others have joined them. Another one called Quique da Costa is now delivering home meals. They're competing now with Telepizza, but with better quality food at the end of the day. So basically, we need to adapt. And to finish this story, I want to tell you another anecdote about a gentleman in Jerusalem who every day goes to pray at the Wailing Wall. A journalist appears up and he says, "Why are you praying, sir?" "Well, I'm praying for world peace, for good, for politicians to behave themselves every day." "And for how long have you been doing that?" "For 30 years. And the journalist asks him, "Well, after 30 years praying for all of this, how do you feel?" And he says, "Well, I feel like I'm just talking to a wall, basically." Dear friends, you can't change events. It's like talking to a wall. So don't talk to the wall. What we need to do is to adapt to change and to everything that's upon us now. And I'm sure that if you do so, you will benefit from it. So after that, a brief introduction, let's introduce you to the person in charge of BTI, the person who's always taking us down the road to innovation year after year. Let's give him a warm hand, Eduardo Anitra. Maybe we should applaud each other. Hi, Eduardo, how are you? This BTI day is different, but normally we do it in an auditorium full of people, jam-packed with people. But now there are over 100 countries, people from over 100 countries watching us. Yes, it's going to be a very specific audience on this occasion. Here you're watching us from home. We can't say hello to each other. We can't shake each other's hands. But we're really, really lucky because we can share science today, share innovation, share these situations that every day we find when we come to work at our surgeries. I'm hoping that today we'll give you a couple of things. Firstly, information and motivation. And encouragement when I say motivation. So let's face up to this really difficult situation that we need to get as close to our patients as possible. and where we need to be as up to date as possible. Pay attention, because I've seen some of the presentations, and I'm not a dentist. I have absolutely nothing to do with this sector, but I really enjoyed them because there's all sorts of new things, very interesting things. So before starting, Eduardo, let's sit down for a couple of seconds because I've got a couple of questions about your first talk. It's like I'm like an inquisitive child who wants to know more. An important thing here is that we're seeing around the world today that all solutions for COVID are science-based. People have criticized science in the past in several fields, but now we've come to realize that science is very important. You've, ever since BTI Institute was founded, concentrated on science, and you never interrupted R&D development despite COVID. Yes, we were born with that aim in mind. BTI is truly a company that had an essential aim when it was set up, which was to know that we are taking firm steps forward and that everything that we do in our clinical practice isn't based on improvisation, but rather is based on scientific evidence. So throughout all this time, we've had all the R&D team working, maxing out, as it were, because we had all the time in the world. We didn't have to travel like we normally do. We didn't have to give talks around the world, and we've concentrated on our work. And I think you're going to see some interesting new things today and subjects to give us food for thought this evening so that we feel inspired when we finish. So you haven't stopped your R&D, you've stepped it up, goodness me. In this first talk, we're going to be talking about the smallest implant in the world. Well, at least that's the way I see it. Yes, you're right. We've managed to break down barriers. We're always sort of on the red line, and sometimes we overstop the red line, but always using science. If there's something that we motivate, it's facing up every day to complex situations, and each and every day we're having to retreat more cases. These are patients who have had implants, have lost them, and what's worst about losing implant is you lose around 90% of bone. So we're really facing difficult situations, extreme situations. What we're trying to show to you is how we can adapt and deal with these situations in a minimally invasive but maximally effective and predictable way. Those of you that are watching us internationally, those of you that aren't from Spain, you need to know that this is a region in Spain called the Basque Country. That's where we are now, and they're very brutish. We joke about this, that very stubborn people, and if they want something, they go on until they get it done. I can just imagine you all sitting around the research table and suddenly somebody says, hey, let's make the smallest implant in the world, and somebody probably replied, I bet you don't, and then you went down and did it. You know what it's like here in the Basque Country. That's perhaps one of the advantages of being from here. I wanted to ask you, after 200 different items, you've got over 200 different items in your implant catalog. Why another one? Well, whenever I go to the design group and I put a challenge to our designers, they normally say to me, okay, well, maybe we should remove something from our catalog, because in the end, if you develop lots of products to try to solve different problems, it would seem that you're trying to create a complex system. And actually what we want to do, and increasingly so, is to bring implant dentistry to general dentists, bring implant dentistry to those dentists who perhaps don't have a much experience in surgery but are very skillful. We want to help these dentists to be more successfully and also help our patients to solve their problems less invasively and more predictably. Look at this. Look at this. Can you see this? This is the smallest implant in the world. I'm going to show it to you. You know how BTI looks after packaging. They like to have attractive packaging, but it's a big box actually because the implant is minute. I'm going to see if I can show you it. I don't know if the camera can get a little nearer because you're not going to believe this. Look at how tiny this is. Get the camera to focus a little. Can you see it? Either you come up close with this camera or you won't be able to see it. Can you see it now? This measures 4.5 millimeters long, but lots of diameters. So the question is, Is it true that in the packaging you add a magnifying glass as well, just in case the implant, you drop it when in the middle of your operation, you can't find it? No, no. What is important is we've managed to adapt the same prosthodontic solutions to these tiny situations where what we want to do is to get these implants to osseointegrate swiftly and with maximum predictability. So there's just one more tool. This isn't going to replace everything that we already had. What it is going to allow us to do for many occasions is to treat patients who to date we had to use more invasive techniques with, sometimes on some occasions with very, very invasive techniques in a very predictable way. And I think we're going to be able to tell you about that in just a few minutes. A final question. This is a bit like the Ferrari of implants or the Rolls-Royce of implants, and I've been here for many conferences. Is this for all implant dentists, or do you need special skills? Well, what we've tried to do is to make sure that all our BTI implant system is adaptable and can be used by general dentists, so that there are also surgical options that can be used by those who put 50 implants a year, who are at the ABC of implant dentistry, but that can also be used by those people who are all day and every day solving complex cases. Those of us that are almost at the Y and Z of the alphabet, solving more extreme situations, but with the same tools, the same possibilities in such a way that it can be scalable. A moment ago, you spoke about your piano course. Of course, anybody that studies piano will start out just tinkling away on the keys, but have got ahead of them a whole world to be able to play the great composers and the great works of music. It's the same for us. What we want is for this system to be adaptable to those surgeons that are dealing with easy situations, to general dentists that don't want to get too involved but want to provide solutions to their patients. And also to rectify and to help those people that have been told that there's no solution to their case. Let's, before we move on to a video of this tiny implants, I'd like to mention you've got Ricardo Tejero and Luis Aracho with you. Both of whom are very highly qualified. Yes, they're heavyweights. I always like to go with the important people in my team, even if I have to go and collect an award. I'm just like the figurehead, as it were, because behind me there's a major team. And even behind Luis and Ricardo, there's a team of people, many engineers, many biologists, all working in that direction. In the end, I always try to make sure that there are representatives from the team with me. But what's really, really important is that behind BTI, okay, we may not be the biggest company in the world, size-wise, but I think we are one of the leading companies in the world. We never say the leader in R&D, and we probably have the research and development team, the most important in the world in regenerative therapy and oral implant dentistry. And what's important is that everything that we're going to tell you is science-based, is research-based. That's why I like to be surrounded by researchers. Obviously, I'm not going to know as much about finite elements as Luis Aracho. I can't know as much about surfaces as Ricardo Tejero. That's why I like to be surrounded by experts in their fields. That's why I like there to be in the design meetings that we have every week, that everybody has the opportunity to speak, to express their opinion, that we learn from our mistakes, as you explained earlier, and taking on board a sentence that actually came up in one of these meetings, which is that we always get things right at the final moment. And what does that mean? It means we're always researching, even when we've made a lot of progress. And you'll see much progress today, but don't think that we're ever going to stop. We're never going to stop. We're going to carry on thinking. I can guarantee that we've left some things out to share with you next year so we can carry on sharing the greatest progress. And you're watching us today from home. So let's see this video of the shortest implant in the world, which, as Aurora said, we're going to carry on researching. By next year, there'll be a much shorter one, I'm sure. Let's just have a look, and I'll show you now Eduardo's video. Let's start now with the scientific side of things. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. We've chosen a situation which we have to face almost every day, cases of extreme maxillas and how to solve the problems of these extreme maxillas. This is something that we find time and time again. And when we talk about these cases at the workshops that you attend when you come from different countries to our workshops. By the way, last year, over 1,500 dentists and surgeons from around 35 countries came to us in Vitoria last year. When I show this case, everybody has their different ideas about how to deal with it. Some people think maybe we should remove all the teeth that the patient has, the very few that they have, and solve this case as if the patient was an edentulous patient. We'll be talking more about that, by the way, tomorrow. But for me, what's really important here is that this patient has a few teeth. They've got a lot missing. They have got a reduced bone. Let's try to find a solution, a good solution for this patient. This is another situation. Yeah, in this case, is a patient that's lost their first or second upper molar. And in addition to this, they've also lost the supporting bone. So we're really in an extreme situation in which we know how to deal with these cases with a typical sinus lift or with a subantral graft. And successfully, we've been dealing with these cases successfully through sinus lifts for the last 25 years. But why not take a more biological approach? Why not be less invasive? And we start out with the following situation. This is a patient who's lost his rear teeth and residual crestal bone of between 5.5 and 6.5 millimeters. The first thing I want to do today is to encourage you to treat this kind of case, because it is a simple case. If we have made a good X-ray study, if we've got the patient's scan images, and if we know how to treat the patient, because inserting an implant that's 6.5 millimeters, or even better, a 5.5 millimeter implant, is a technique that is within all your hands. If we've got the dental nerve at 6.5, we can leave a 1 millimeter safety margin, and we can put a 5.5 millimeter implant completely safely. And we've been doing that for over 10 years now successfully, with a great deal of success. And here you can see that with 5-year follow-up studies, the stability is there. The implant is very near the dental nerve. The patient hasn't suffered from any paresthesia, and we've recovered 100% of his function. We already published in 2008 studies on short implants, over 500 implants, almost 300 patients, with 99.2% of success. And we've carried on studying. Here's another study with an 8-year follow-up, almost 1,300 implants, over 600 patients, and a success rate of 99.3%. Another study, a 12-year follow-up, in this case with 75 patients, and almost 99% success rate. And what's even more important, because it's very difficult to get studies with 15 years of follow-up. Here we've got 75 patients, 15 years follow-up, and 95% success rate. That's where we like to be, evidence-based, and with results, as you can see, that are giving us major successes. So, based on science, we're going to be treating these cases. And this situation in where in the past we'd have used a 5.5 millimeter implant, and it may well be that some of you are reluctant to locating an implant in the dental nerve. We've got another option, which is that of having a 4.5 millimeter long implant. We'll see later with different diameters that are available that can adapt to the crestal bone's width and through which we're going to get some optimum excellent results. And as we'll see later, will biomechanically give almost the same results as the 5.5 millimeter implant. This allows us to carry on breaking down barriers and deal with cases in which we only have 4.5 millimeters of bone height, and where you can see with a 4.5 millimeter implant, and even if some of the walls is going to be exposed and showing some of the implant, what we can do is add a graft bone that we can harvest from the drilling process or using a bone scraper to harvest autologous bone and overcorrect. And here you can see we've managed to achieve vertical growth of 1 millimeter and 1.5 millimeters even, almost 100% success rate. I'd say that almost 100% of cases, what we're obtaining are these vertical growth rates. Why? Because we're not too ambitious, because 1 millimeter vertical growth is far more predictable than trying to achieve 4, because all the graft that we're going to add is bone harvested from the patient himself, cells from the patient himself, proteins from the patient himself, as you'll see later. So this allows us to break down barriers and to face up to situations which are increasingly difficult, with major successes, as I'm showing you now. These are clinical cases loaded with 4.5 millimeter implants, and as you'll see, we're obtaining success levels of 100%. And even if it was only 99%, we'd be equally happy. What does this allow us to do? It allows us to carry on breaking through barriers, facing situations in which we only have 3.5 millimeters or 4 millimeters of residual bone. And even in these cases, place an implant of 4.5 millimeters, achieve vertical growth. It's a predictable, simple technique. But more than that, even when there's only 3 millimeters of bone, we're going to be able to have implants, once again in a predictable fashion. Because if we get 1 millimeter of vertical growth, even in an atrophic mandible, always with an extreme gingival biotype, always in the extreme situations, the less ambitious we are, the more predictable our technique will be. And this is what we're going to show you now. Here you can see extreme cases, how we've obtained 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeters of vertical growth. Once again, this is a predictable technique. And as I'm going to show you shortly, within all your reach in your surgeries. A few moments ago, I was talking with Mr. More about how important it is to develop a system that's accessible for all of you, accessible to all of you. That's how the core system was developed, an evolution of our narrow platform. And here you can see we've got implants going from 3.3 millimeters of diameter to 4.7 millimeters of diameter, with a great range of different heights. With these implants, you're going to be able to deal with 90% of situations, those of you that are involved in general dentistry and those that don't have extreme situations. And all of these, what's really important is they use the same prosthodontic components, follow the same protocols and techniques that are simple and accessible. Not just easy to place the implant, but also then to move on to the restoration. When we have very narrow crestal bone, in this case we've got the 3.0 family of implants that go from 2.5 millimeters to 3.3 millimeters. We've got 12 and shortly another 5-year follow-up study of implants with these diameters of around 3 millimeters, and once again, success rates of around 98 to 99%. These are the Interna Plus implants, the ones that you can see now, and these are the ones that we will use when we're working on the maxilla in rear regions of the mouth, in those bones that are very have low density, and once again in extreme situations. So these are the different platforms that we have: 3.0, the 3.5, the 4.1. Both in whether you use the blue or the yellow platform, the prosthetic components are the same, just different diameters there. But today, almost exclusively, we're going to be talking about these three platforms, these three prosthodontic platforms, to simplify our surgical protocols. This is the core implant, and look here at how versatile, how many lengths we've got, from 4.5 millimeters in length right up to 15 millimeters in length. So quite clearly, very versatile range and many possibilities of solving all the situations that we have to face. But today I'd like to take a step further. Does it make sense today, in the year 2020, to be inserting 15-millimeter long implants? In our surgery, we're no longer using 13-millimeter or 15-millimeter implants, well, maybe one a year, but nor are we using implants of 10 or 11.5 millimeters. These are the implants, these are the lengths, rather, that we are using today. Interestingly, I've included here the 8.5 millimeter implant because I don't want to be too far out, but I ought to say, really, the implants that we use today are between 4.5, 6.5, 7.5 at max. It's important to understand that a 6.5 millimeter implant has the same body as a 7.5 or an 8.5 millimeter implant. The only difference is that it's got a longer apex. So when will we use longer 7.5 or 8.5 millimeter implants? Well, in those operations that need a little bit of expansion, or where we need to facilitate implant insertion. Otherwise, we'll be using much shorter length implants. Look at this 4.5 millimeter implant. It's available in all diameters in the core range, and the same goes for the Interna Plus range, from 4.5 millimeters right up to 6 millimeters, a new diameter for a new implant. This is the 6 millimeter one for the Interna Plus, so that you can deal with all situations using as few platforms and as few prosthetic components as possible. How have we got here? Has it just been a mad idea that we've had? No, we've always followed what's happening in the clinical situations where we find complex situations. And when we want to solve something, at least when I want to solve something, I always do the same thing. I pick up the phone, call the R&D department and say, hey, do you think we could meet up this afternoon and analyze and study this situation? And I've invited Luis Aracho to spend some time with us today. Luis is in charge of all the biomechanics in BTI. He's an expert in finite elements. How long have you been working with finite elements? Since 1980. 1980, the last century, 40 years. 40 years working with finite elements. And many of you who are listening today probably don't even know what finite elements are. I'm going to ask Luis to, in just a couple of words, that's typically Spanish, we try and explain things, just a couple of words, to explain to us what these tools that we're seeing on the screen now are, because these are tools that can be used to take surgical steps forward. And take surgical steps in the right direction, of course. Tomorrow we'll be talking about immediate loading. Today we'll introduce it to you a little bit. And you'll realize that unfortunately there are many occasions when you go to a conference and somebody tells you about sort of an idea, maybe a wacky idea, but may sound great, but has no scientific base to it. And when that happens to me, usually I go back and I call Luis and I say to him, what do you think about this? And normally he replies to me, nonsense, complete nonsense. So Luis, just show us the tools that you use. How do you analyze? And at the same time, design, of course, those implants that today we're all using in our surgeries nowadays. An implant is a complex system comprised of a series of parts connected to each other, usually by a screw connection, which is then supported on a different kind of material, very different to titanium, which is bone. So there you find so many different connections and different friction, contact, shearing forces once it's all osseo-integrated. That to understand all of this, what we used is this tool that you can see. And this is called the finite element analysis. The finite element analysis is based on a mathematical model. And this mathematical model, what it does is it models reality in the computer. To do that, you have to input data about material, different support conditions, who is applying the load, and where that load ends up. And at the same time, we have to model the part's geometry and each and every one of its interactions. For me, what's important is that of all these studies that you make with finite elements, and today, in fact, we're going to be showing new studies with finite elements. The first studies that we did 20-something years ago, which I had real difficulties in understanding, but I thought was fascinating as well. But I always wanted to check this because I'd always heard about studies using the instrument machine, fatigue measurement machines. And you said to me, yeah, we use fatigue machines, but you need to realize the different kind of information that I can obtain from the fatigue machines and from a finite element analysis. On the left, you can see a piece of fatigue measurement equipment. And tell us what's happening with the image on the right. As we said earlier, the finite element analysis is a mathematical model, which, of course, uses estimates. But however you do it, there's going to be an error. But we've limited that error. We know how big the error is, and we can guarantee that the error is small enough that any conclusions that we draw from our calculations are right and the same as what's happening in reality. To do that, we use reality, of course. And reality is simulated on the testing machines. And what you see on the image on the right is the same thing, the same test, but mathematically modeled. On the right, and of course, we're measuring reality. We measure the forces. We measure where a crack appears, what load is sufficient to break everything, and we've seen that there's a correlation. What I mean with that is that the test that we carry out and the calculations that we make of the test coincide. They correlate together. So we can believe the calculations that we've made. And using those calculations, we take design decisions. And we answer the questions that Eduardo asks us. And for those of us that aren't expert, all these colors that you can see on the right, the red color, that's a stress peak, yes. Yeah, red means the stress peak. In this case, we've seen that in both cases, reality and our test, the platform area of the implant gets squashed, and it gets squashed in the test and in the mathematical model. The screw is stretched in the test and in the mathematical model, and the gap as well appears in the same place and at the same load, and the whole thing collapses at the same moment. That means that we can believe, we know that what we're doing is right. So With these tools, as I said, and as Luis said earlier, we've been working together for over 20 years. At that time, we had long hair and a fringe. We went to school together. That's sufficient on that subject. But we published this study in 2010. It's a study that we'd carried out earlier. But for me, it's a study that actually completely changed the way I approach clinical practice. And it was a study on how an implant behaves under vertical loads with different diameters of your implant. And we saw that as the diameter of the implant goes up, we could see that stresses went down. It's, as you said earlier, in the first turn of the thread, you see red is the stress peak. You can see the color scale on the right as well. And here, by the way, we calculate this always in the same way. When we calculate, we try to only change the minimum number of magnitudes possible. And in this case, we've only changed diameter. The same load, same material, same bone, all exactly the same except for diameter. So we completely isolate perfectly the influence of diameter. And the influence can be seen in this curve. So for small short implants, stress is high. As we increase diameter, stress goes down, but goes down in a greater proportion than diameter goes up. We can see that this proportion gradually stabilizes in diameters of 6. That's a little bit why it's a little absurd to look into diameters greater than 6. Yes, from 2.5 millimeters to 6 millimeters, you see when diameter increases like that, there's a drop in stress. But as you get nearer 5.5, 6, an increase in diameter doesn't minimize so much stress. It's like you're not making use of the extra diameter that you're achieving. So we think that there's probably not a great deal of meaning to using much wider implants. Something else that's very important that we've seen in this study is that stress levels are located virtually in the first 3 turns. Here you can see a study with implants of 5.5, 7.5, and 11 millimeters in length, and you can see the same goes for these. An advantage of this method is that it gives us it tells us exactly what's happening in all the different points. And it tells you the forces, which force is pushing, what's pulling. So what you see here in this diagram is contact force between bone and implant. Because once an implant's osseointegrated, this seal, this union is very intimate. It's very solid, very sound. So here you can see how the forces interact between this part of the implant, which is exactly in contact with the bone, and the bone that's in contact with the implant, how they interact with each other, bone and implant. So if we increase implant diameter, we see a significant drop in stress levels in a far more difficult situation, because in this case, these are lateral loads we're talking about. Yes. Here we've checked both in stress and contact force that the osteoblasts, let's talk about them, that are up near the top are on the front line. They're far busier than those that are lower down. And those that practically have to deal with 95% of load are those that are right at the top. I don't want to talk about turns of a thread, because different implants have different measurements. I prefer to say millimeters. So What are we trying to do with this? We were trying to see if we could go a little bit lower than 5 millimeters. And in fact, there was one that we launched about 10 years ago, but it was 4.5 meters long, but it was an external, had an external connection. We weren't too happy with the external connection, so we decided to look into how we could solve the problem with an internal connection. And we started looking a few years ago now into a possible 4.5 millimeter implant. And we saw, yes, right, with a vertical loading, variations of implant length. Here you can see all the different scale of colors in the first millimeters of the implant, as Luis would say. And they're all the same. But if you look at the mathematical data, and these aren't feelings, these aren't just things that I invent, these are precise figures. You can see that the greatest stresses in first and second turn, and it's the same for a 4.5 millimeter implant, and there's hardly any variation if you take it right up to 8 or 9 millimeter implants. It's basically irrelevant. What's the conclusion that we can draw from this? Whenever we're splinting implants, whenever we're splinting, for example, 3 implants, these implants are only going to work under vertical loads. So there's no point in using longer implants than 4.5 or 5.5 millimeter in length. Maybe with 5.5 millimeters length, it's probably easier to put it in because it's slightly longer and it's easier to work with that kind of implant. But a 4.5 millimeter long implant will behave fantastically. So what did we do? We carried on looking into this. We carried on looking at how these implants behave when subject to lateral load. And when subject to lateral loads, there's a significant increase in stress. But once again, the thing is, what happens here in the case of lateral loading is that unlike when you have vertical load, when the whole of the bone perimeter receives the same stress, in this case it's different. Here what you get is the one side of the implant, that is the side that's opposing the load, will be suffering compression stress, on the other traction stress. And this is what we in engineering call bending. So there, the ability to suffer the same load is lower. What that means is that to put up with the same amount of lateral loading, the bone has to be tenser and has to work more, as it were. And this completely changes stress distribution. And here we've seen how the difference between vertical and lateral load means stress levels go up. But still, even so, even when increasing the length of the implant, stresses don't go down. So, by changing implant diameter, stresses accumulate there, where you see them now. But as we increase implant diameter, in this case, and here we're talking about greater stresses and more unhelpful, as it were, load direction, there's going to be an increase in stress, of course, but once again, it's only the first turns that are working. Millimeters, 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 please. Sorry, I keep forgetting to say millimeters. So what we need to be clear on is that we need to concentrate more on adapting our diameter of our implants to biomechanical needs than worrying about length. For decades now, we've been inserting implants that are far longer than the patient needs. And as we'll see later, with some major drawbacks when we have to move on to restoration. Well, this is a typical case in which to solve treatment for an edentulous patient, he was given 4 implants so as to use longer implants. The distal implants are at a 45-degree angle. And we've seen that as we increase implant angle, stresses shoot up, as you can see in the images. So the most predictable situation is with vertical loading, even with extra short implants. Once you move up to 45-degree loads, stresses multiply by 11-fold. Incredible, incredible. This is the effect of what I mentioned earlier. Vertical loading, you get the whole of the perimeter is working in unison, as it were. But when the load is inclined or lateral, you're forcing part of the implant to work in one way and the other side to work in the opposite way. So they're almost fighting against each other. And what that means is that the average stress goes up tremendously. So in this case as well, maybe we could draw some clinical conclusions from this, which is what we're really interested in. For all of us, this is what interesting. In this case, instead of having had the 13-millimeter angled implant in the same place, at the same fulcrum, here we could have a 4.5-millimeter long implant, and the behavior would be radically better. Not the same, but radically better. And if we splint, then it's like Christmas. So the advantage of having a much shorter implant is that we can put the implant far distally on many occasions. We can reduce or even make the lever arm disappear. And significant improvement. So just remember, a tool like finite element analysis, if it's properly used, of course, by experts, because it's important that each of these images that I'm showing you today, you need to remember is the ones that we've taken from your team who've been working on this for years. And as you said earlier, you're only as good as your latest innovation or your latest design. So what sort of conclusions can we draw from this? Can we put an implant at an angle, 10 degrees? Yes. Yes, if for whatever reason maybe you need that. But never intentionally put your implants in an angle, because by putting it at an angle of 20 degrees, stress goes up by 600%. I'm not talking about 10 or 15%. Remember when we were talking about reducing implant length, we were talking about magnitudes of 5% or less sometimes. And now, if you put implants in an angle, you're talking about magnitudes of 900 or 1100%. This should help us to draw clinical conclusions, because if we've got scientific evidence, and I feel there's no point in intentionally angling implants, because you're just going to increase stress unnecessarily. And not only that, but from a restorative viewpoint, you're just complicating your patient's case, and it's pointless. We've studied also what happens if we add a transepithelial abutment. This is like when you were talking about earlier, you said it's a set of like internal parts, and you've seen that a transepithelial will absorb stress. Yes, the effect that you get is that stiffness, as it goes from the contact point on the crown with the antagonist down to the bone, is more harmonious. And the result is that maximum stresses are more progressive. There's no super increase that you get when you put a prosthesis directly on an implant. Let's have a look at it. I love this curve. Here you can see almost everything that we've researched in short implants and diameters and lengths since 1990. It's all on one diagram. We've plotted what's been happening, and it's a little bit of an explanation to this, because for the moment we've managed to stop Eduardo at 4.5 millimeters. That's where we've stopped for the moment. But here, what we drew is what we made rather are 3 sets of calculations. with implants of 3.3, 3.5, and 4.75 diameter. This is the case of a perfectly osseointegrated implant. I'm not talking here about immediate loading, but lateral loading, and it's in cortical bone, but they're single tooth implants. What we've tried to do here is to get ourselves to a very difficult situation when the implant's subject to real difficulty. So the only thing that we changed is length in each of these cases. And here you can see these nice curve really is for around 50 calculations each, all of which require many calculations. Sometimes we leave the machine running over the weekend and come back on Monday to see how things are. If there's been any mistakes, we check, we rectify. And what we see is that stresses, as we've shortened lengths from 1990 onwards today, haven't increased much. But what we do see is that if we increase diameter, if we go from a 3.5 millimeter to a 4.7 millimeter diameter, we go from the orange curve to the pink one. That means the stress levels go right down. They drop for all lengths. So what are we seeing? And this really has been confirmed by Eduardo's clinical experience, is it's far more important to choose correctly diameter than length. And we saw that in 1999 with implants of 8.5 millimeter implants, 2002, etc., etc. It reflects what's happening in clinical practice. What I mean by that is that we didn't do anything without firstly checking that clinical practice was right. And we've stopped at 4.5 millimeters. Why? Because 4.5 millimeters is a point where even if we shorten the implants more, which may be necessary if there's been a great deal of bone loss, we aren't reaching a point where length is important. That is the area where the curves go up. As long as we're a long way from this change in slope, we can happily use short implants. And what's more, one of the things that we've seen for all of us that are treating patients with peri-implantitis, what do we see? Well, on many occasions, we see an implant that, for whatever reason, maybe has led to a vertical bone loss and is just anchored by 2 or 3 millimeters. And we have difficulties in removing the implant. We're not going to talk about removing implants today. We're going to carry on with the line. So, Luis, thanks for your explanations. It's great to be here. I'll call you back. Don't escape. And thanks especially to Luis for the effort that both you and your team have been making over so many years. Because when I see them tinkering with computers, I have to say that behind every single image you've seen today, there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of work, of trying to improve the model, a modeling method, and use not just with tools, but the adaptation of tools to situations. And now we move on to my other passion. One is research, and the other is clinical practice. And let's look at how we would face this situation. A situation where we can see a patient has severe bone resorption. We've got 5 millimeters of residual crestal bone. And nowadays, treating this case with a 4.5 millimeter implant is a situation that's simple and predictable, and which any dentist could do, because if you know where the dental nerve is, you know where the cortical bone limit is. We don't like using drill stops. We think using drill stops is going back in time, going back to the last century. It's meaningless these days. If you've got these kind of images, you know where your cortical bone is, you know where the buccal cortical bone is 1.5 millimeters shorter than the lingual cortical bone. If I had to put a drill stop there, where would I put it? It's pointless. It's better to use the a front cutting drill, which is the ideal replacement for drill stops. It's a tunneling drill, and it'll allow me to gradually drill and get closer to the dental nerve safely, because I've got lingual cortical bone, which will act as a drill stop and allow me to go slowly but surely forwards. So it's not difficult to advance in these cases. You can see how in the more anterior implant here, in this case, we're using a 3.5 millimeter implant, because as it's splintered to the next one, we're in a predictable situation, and we've got a 4.5 millimeter implant in the rear area, and we're going to have immediate loading in all cases, as I'll show you later. And there are dozens of them, by the way. We're already attaining 100% success, even with immediate loading. And in such an extreme situation, we're getting excellent results. However, immediate loading is always joined with our titanium articulated bars that can guarantee stiffness and can guarantee that this works as a set, one block, as it were. Here you can see how CAD/CAM tools help us refine minimum details, just change 10 or 15 degrees. The screw emergence that facilitates as well us manufacturing a ceramic bridge manufactured in CAD/CAM, always using transepithelial abutments. And in the case of very resorbed maxillars, here you can see we've got a multi-IM implant. In the anterior one, I've got a multi-IM implant, which is 3.5 millimeters. And here, why do we do that? Because we want this to be supragingival, never subgingivally. Look at the disproportion between implant and crown. We've been publishing about this for many years now, for almost a decade now. And in this case, it's irrelevant, this implant crown ratio, unlike the idea that we dentists have in the proportion between roots and crown of a natural tooth. It's a completely different kettle of fish we're talking about here. By shortening implants so much and by using internal connections, we've had to modify not the transepithelial sleeve, but in the screw length. But once again, we've studied this, we've included specific technology so that preloading is the same. So the only thing that really needs to be considered is that 4.5 millimeter implants are going to use specific transepithelials for their length, for this length, 4.5 millimeters. We need to have a special box for them, because if we put a conventional transepithelial there, we would just be screwing, but we'd see that the sleeve would be left loose. The same would go for a healing abutment. So if we're talking about 4.5 millimeters implants for core implants, narrow platform core implants, here you can see where we've got lengths that go from 2 to 5 millimeter in length, and once again different emergence profiles between 4 and right up to 5. In this case, we're talking about the expanded one. For the Universal Plus platform, once again, there are specific transepithelials. And when we change to the expanded platform, the same, with a tremendous range. And this allows us to solve cases predictably and simply. So in 100% of cases, we are able to use a multi-IM transepithelial abutment. Are there going to be components for cement retained prostheses? Yes, even if we wouldn't recommend them. Our idea is that all the work that we do, and in fact all the work we do is uses the bioblock idea, follows this bioblock idea, and this idea of using trans epithelials. What are the advantages of that? Well, a hermetic seal. We want a hermetic seal between the trans epithelium, the abutment. We want a hermetic seal in the subcritical area, in the where the prosthesis meets the trans epithelium. That's why in these rear regions, these rear areas, we're always going to use place the trans epithelial supragingivally. I've got Ricardo Tijera with me. He's in charge of surfaces. He's in charge of the surfaces department. I spend a lot of time arguing with him about how each tissue type can adapt to different surfaces. But he's essential to the idea of bioblock because it means that a prosthesis can be reversible, is reversible as the transepithelial, but also the implant. In fact, we've developed a connection which means that if for whatever reason maybe we had to remove this implant, it would be reversible. So this idea of reversibility of osseointegration, I think is such an important concept as osseointegration itself. It's the evolution of osseointegration. It's being able to have an implant that you could take out and replace again, i.e. an implant which can predictably be removed if we're in a situation that requires so. But let's now concentrate on something which is also important, which is versatility. Versatility of our system and how we've managed to adapt each and every surface to every tissue, and how we resolve doubts. Because there are always questions about how high should the implant be? Should it be subcrestally? There's some authors who say implants should be 2 millimeters subcrestal. That's not the idea that we follow. Transepithelials, is it the same to do cement retained prosthesis or directly screw retained prosthesis onto the implant? Let's just ask Ricardo to give us some information, to throw some light on how we can take decisions with a scientific basis. Thank you so much, Eduardo. It's a pleasure once again to be here with you to tell you about what's behind this strategy, this approach that we call the bioblock, which is actually striking a balance, a matter of striking a balance between biology and biomechanics. We spoke about the hermetic seal between different components, between the screw, the prosthesis, the implant, and the connection. Also has its own importance in the interaction between surfaces and tissues, more specifically with those surfaces that come into contact with soft tissues. That's where the T-Golden surface comes into play, which is a nanostructured surface precisely invented for these peri-implant soft tissue areas where we're seeking extra safety from possible bacterial colonizations if there's been exposure, or because there may be greater numbers of bacteria in this area, where not only do we want great aesthetics, but also safety from peri-implantitis. These nanostructured surfaces are placed precisely in this context, in the case of the junctional epithelium and the area which is not very keratinized, and where you find all these fibroblasts. Fibroblasts were in charge of creating the peri-implant soft tissue. So their adhesion, the fact that they settle on the T-Golden surface is going to allow collagen secretion and in the end generate a good seal or adhesion with the soft tissue onto this surface. And that's what leads us to this hermetic or biological seal that we're talking about. So it's very important, together with epithelial cells and the hemidesmosome union with the surface, to look at these fibroblasts. And we've done this and look at how they behave. And we've done this to compare different surfaces, different types of surfaces that come into play here. We've got the machine surface, which is the standard surface that we sometimes incorrectly say a polished, call a polished surface, but it's a machined surface which is characteristically very shiny. Then another one that's similar to the machine surface, but the only thing that it's got is an anodized yellow color on top of it to try to give it a better color. A color that we get with our tea golden surface, but which additionally has its special structural superficial effects, surface effects. And it's the interaction with the fibroblasts which is so important for this biological seal. The first thing that we can say is that the adhesions are statistically greater with a tea golden surface than with other surfaces. This is important because not only are we going to get a greater number of cells in charge of creating more cells and greater quality cells, we can see under the microscope that these cells are laid out, or as it were, on the surface so that they have a greater possibility of generating these tissues. These are sort of elongated, and you can see how they cover a greater surface area in comparison to the blob-shaped surfaces that you get on cells on other surfaces. This is so important, and it's these focal adhesions that we've wanted to concentrate on here. So what we did was we vinculin stained them to see whether there really were more focal adhesions. You can see that now on the next images where fibroblasts are stretched, that they are laid out in such a way that they are able to secrete peri-implant soft tissue, and that's what's happening there in the middle one, but not in the other two, where you're seeing blob-shaped cells and very few focal adhesions. Please just allow me to stop you there, Ricardo. When we started looking into this, and we've spent over a decade looking into it, we analyzed precisely the best surface for soft tissue and how important it is that it be separate from the implant. Can we now perhaps move on to some clinical protocols or recommendations? Looking now at these images, because these images that you see in fluorescent colors, we could say that this is a hemidesmosome. We could say that we are adding plasma around our trans epithelials, and adding a fibrin mesh, we're going to increase the number of fibroblasts. Yes, of course. Not only will we increase the number of fibroblasts, but we're also like building them their perfect home, a home where we're going to feel at home to do their job properly, which is to, at the end of the day, generate a tissue which will allow us to seal this area and create quality soft tissue. So, if osseointegration is important, that is the adhesion of the implant to bone, the adhesion of peri-implant tissue to the transepithelial is vital because it's our first line of defense. You need to remember that bacteria will always come from the oral cavity, well, mainly from the oral cavity. So this is the first battle that we need to win in our war. So we always defend this idea in 2020, as we are today. We are always inserting implant right at the crestal level. We'll be talking about implant surfaces more tomorrow to obtain maximum surface of the implant surrounded by bone. Because if we put the implant 1 millimeter or 2.5 millimeters subcrestally, we're not gaining anything. What's more, I think it's important to reiterate that the surface designs that we've created are versatile because we know that biology is versatile. What the implant and transepithelial abutment are going to be exposed to. It's not a straight line that you can read in a manual. It's a tissue that has different dimensions. So this is the same versatility that we adapt and accommodate in the surface of the transepithelia, as well as the different surfaces that we have on the implants, which is part of what we call bioblock. That's why we attach so much importance to, when we talk about immediate loading of using a transepithelial abutment. Hopefully the final one. If for whatever reason maybe you have to change a length for a shorter transepithelial, well, okay, do it once, but don't keep changing transepithelials. Try to have it just there once. We'll be talking back against transepithelials again tomorrow, but being able to offer our patients a surface where their gum will adhere, and this will be the first line of defense against bacterial plaque. This is a great progress. Allow me to just mention another study. This was one we published a time ago, as you know, where we put these gingival fibroblasts to fight with bacteria, a bacteria that destroy tissues, these bacteria that are involved in periimplantitis. And what we saw was that as opposed to the normal kind of surfaces that these parts use, the BTI golden surface had statistically better results. That means that there was far lower risk of bacterial colonization. That's what's important. As we need to progress, Ricardo, please allow me to say thank you. I remember many, many years ago when we launched our Optima surface, Ricardo said, I'm going to be left without work if I don't carry on researching. And I never thought that now you'd have more work than ever. I didn't want him to leave him without a job, because the more we learn, the more we need to know, and the more we want to know, and that's how we progress. So we've seen the importance now of transepithelials. Let's take another step forward. What do we do when we only have 2 millimeters of residual crestal bone? Well, in these cases, what we do is we remove or transpose to one side, the dental nerve. This is a simple technique. Well, maybe a little bit more complicated. I'd say that if you're going to do this, have a microscope, you need to be more experienced to do this. We've got a great deal of experience in this. Ever since we've been working on regenerative therapy, we've been taking tremendous progress. Mr. Mores waving at me, and you've been waving at me for a while now. So maybe I need to let you take the floor again, yes, because I need to tell you something very important, which is our publishers. So you may be wondering, is this man now going to advertise to us? And yes, I'm here to advertise to you. Well, this is a book I wanted to recommend to you. You want to know about short implants? Go to our publishing house. It's called Teamwork Editorial, and find this book, Short and Extra Short Implants. It's in all kinds of different languages. I'm sure you'll be able to find your language, so there's no excuse. If you're seeking clinical excellence, we've got all sorts of books. We've got books about prostheses, about periimplantitis, which is another fascinating subject. We've got books about atrophic maxillas. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a dentist at all. But this book, for example, Short and Extra Short Implants, I use it. It's on my bedside table. I open it at night and I fall asleep in a couple of minutes straight away. It's a great book if you have insomnia problems. But no, seriously, it's a great book. I know you're interested in it. Look at this. Look at how well it's presented. Look at the great photos it has. Anybody, as I said earlier, that seeks clinical excellence, here's a great range. And we've got books actually that we publish that have nothing to do with dentistry. One about breathing and one about sleep. So having said that, let's move on to the next talk. Eduardo, did you like this teleshopping advert that I did? Yeah, I'm always being bossed around. I'm being told, hey, More's coming on stage, but it is true. What's interesting about this this book on short implants, is that a lot of the information that we've been talking about today related to biomechanics is included. And you get a more step-by-step approach there. It's in our books. The books have been translated into 5 languages, so you've got it in paper format, digital format. So there's no excuses. They've been translated to 5 languages. So if you don't have any of these languages, because some people say, I don't know how to read. Well, we'll give you a reading course. Don't worry. We've got a reading course. Yes, I'm serious about that. So no excuses. If you read this book, and I've read it, once I took part in a program called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and I was asked a question about periimplantitis, and I knew the answer. Anyway, the next talk you're going to have with you, Aintzane Torre, who's in charge of training at BTI. She's a maxillofacial surgeon as well. What's the title of the talk going to be? Well, maybe it's going to be clinical application of everything we've said so far. Yes? Okay, so I'll leave you in Eduardo Aintzane's hands. Thank you. We've been looking at difficult situations in the mandible. We're now going to look at the maxilla. What's the application of everything that we've been talking about when we're talking about difficult situations in the maxilla? We spoke earlier about sinus lifting, sinus augmentation with a lateral window being a technique that we used routinely, and more than routinely 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. At that time, we'd be doing one a day in our surgery. Now it's only one a month. Why? Because we've developed techniques, other techniques that allow us to solve these situations. So, in a situation, in a difficult situation of 4 millimeters of bone resorption, now we can solve that with a short implant. Even you can do a mini sinus lift and solve this problem. But these 4.5 millimeters implant are going to allow us to place implants in these situations with or without grafts, bone grafts, depending upon our skill, of course. So, if you've got maxillas that are very atrophic, with just 4 millimeters of bone loss, a 4.5 millimeter implant will allow us to solve this situation. In general, here, you're always going to have a far greater width. We're going to be able to add 4, 4.5, or even 6 millimeter diameter implants. And what happens is, well, you realize that as you broaden the diameter of your implant, you see the patient with such a short implant doesn't need a sinus lift, but rather with just a simpler technique, we can solve our problems. Or where necessary, we can be assisted with a graft to secure the implant's sealing. So we can solve these cases, but what happens when you're talking about 2 or 3 millimeters of residual crestal bone? This would seem a clear indication for a sinus lift. Once again, we've carried on thinking about this and to see whether we can take a step further. And what happens is that as they're 4.5 millimeter implants with different diameters, we can adapt implant to bone density. And the moment we've got more than 600 Hounsfield field density in those 2 millimeters, that are where the thread that's going to support the implant is going to be. I'm going to be able to use extra short implants and avoid a sinus lift. And just with the bone that I've recovered, that I've harvested from drilling, get this 1 or 1.5 millimeters of vertical growth. Other options when facing these extreme situations, we can use here broader, wider implants that are still 4.5 millimeters long, and where there's only 2.5 millimeters of bone height, you can still, when you broaden the implant, you don't have to gain very much. So this is another option, another technique, and a resource at your fingertips to solve these problems. If it's a case in which you've actually harvested quite a lot of bone and you want a longer implant, we saw earlier with finite element studies that there's not a greater point to this. In the past, we'd have here in this case maybe put a 6.5 millimeter implant here. Now we consider that over-treatment, because if you use a shorter implant, you minimize any error possibilities. Let's move on to clinical practice now. A patient that's lost a molar, a conventional situation which in the past we'd have used a sinus lift to treat. Let's see if we can do something different. Let's see if we can do something a little more. Look at the remaining bone. We've decided that maybe we can use a 5.5 millimeter diameter implant, which may be 4.5 or 5.5 millimeters long. And look at the gain. Look at the gain, a very simple technique. Predictable technique. And as Mr. Mores said earlier, it's explained step by step in this book that we published a while back now. And here you can see the protocol and the results. I can carry on showing you many cases that we've solved in this way, because it's a really effective procedure. Here we have a patient with advanced periodontal disease. He's lost his teeth We've got width there, so we can have implants that are 6 millimeters in diameter. What are we going to do? We can decide whether we want 5.5 or 6.5 millimeters diameter, depending, of course, on the initial bone stability that we've got. 5.5 millimeters in length or 4.5 millimeters in length, and then the diameter we adapt. The anterior implant, once again here we can see in the image extreme bone resorption. Extra short implants, which of course are already included in our BTI scan, will facilitate the scan study and will make it easier to take decisions when we're sitting in front of our computers. Here we've got some mini sinus lifts, and a patient that initially would have had to go through 2 conventional sinus lifts is going to be subject to a far less invasive technique. And what's even more important, even more or equally as predictable, and for what we now know about biomechanics, and here you can see the gains that we've obtained. Let's now look at another case. Lower free end, extreme resorption, and upper molar with extreme resorption. 10 years ago, I'd have done a conventional sinus lift, I admit it, but nowadays we're going to use a different technique in the free end. We'll use short implants. There you can see the transalveolar lift. It's an extreme situation here in which when you place this implant, you realize that with just a little tiny bit of graft, just the amount that we've got from drilling, we can solve this problem. In the mandible, an extra short 4.5 millimeter implant, immediate loading, and once again, here you can see the results. This is the final prosthesis with a 4.5 millimeter implant and 5.5 millimeters long and a transalveolar lift. Results of our research with transalveolar lift. What we're seeing here, what we've published, we published this study on 48 patients, and we saw that using extra short implants was predictable. We've published another study subsequent to that with 1 and 2 year follow-up, once again with excellent results. And this is another study analyzing the gain that's been made. This has been surprising to us in the studies that we've carried out. And we've seen how with initial residual bones of 4.7 millimeters, after a year, we've got 8.4 millimeters of bone. And we've carried on gaining bone. And this is what's encouraged us to move on to other studies. So instead of starting with 4 millimeters, we're actually reducing and starting with just bones of 2 or 3 millimeters. There needs to be a minimum amount of residual bone, of course, for initial stability. And these are the results that we're getting. So we've seen that this is a safe, predictable, and stable technique. What do we do when we perforate? We all make mistakes, but for me the most important thing to remember is that the best treatment for this kind of mistake is not making this mistake. I know this sounds obvious, but it's actually not obvious. Why? Because if I've got 4 millimeters of residual bone, and what I want to do is to insert an 8.5 millimeter implant, then I'm really increasing quite notably the possibilities of perforating the Schneiderian membrane. But if with this patient I'm happy to just use a 4.5 or 5.5 or 6.5 millimeter implant, then practically the danger disappears, the risks of perforating the Schneiderian membrane. So the best treatment for a Schneiderian membrane perforation is not to perforate it. Let's not be overambitious. Let's not be unconsciously overambitious and try to insert a longer implant than the biomechanical situation requires. Another situation, if I've made a mistake and I've already got the perforation, okay, I'm a bit brutish. I've made this perforation. Now what should I do? If you've got a 4.5 millimeter implant, you can just stick it in as a drill stop, as it were, is the best way of doing that. The thing is, with a 3.5, 4 millimeters residual bone, the implant will osseointegrate and the case will be solved simply. So, to treat these perforations, increase your implant diameter and use a extra short 4.5 millimeter implant. I'm going to end on a technique which I also find fascinating. When you spend all your time looking at results and scans, ideas come to mind to deal in this case with this situation. Once again, we're talking here about a single tooth implant. In my surgery 10 years ago, or even less, even more recently, these cases we treat with a sinus lift and a lateral window. What are we going to do in this case? We're going to take things slowly. Slowly. Just the bone that we get from drilling this implant mixed with plasma is going to be used to get this mini sinus lift and just put an implant that's 4.5 millimeters long. And these implants are going to be used like temporary implants. Why? Because I know that if I'm just minimally ambitious, the possibility of perforating the Schneiderian membrane will also be minimal. So let's use the 4.5 millimeter implant. Here you can see CBCT. Once I just finished surgery, looks like everything's happy. The graft is at the end. I know that I haven't perforated the membrane. Everything's where it should be. And look 4 months. Look at this 4-month image. Everything that's above that is bone. And many of you may be saying, oh, yeah, you can see that in the X-ray. It looks like it. So to decide to see what was really happening, we removed the implant, we made a biopsy, and we saw it was bone. It was bone. And we had like a stop, like a lid, a very consistent lid on top of the implant. So what did we do? We removed this implant. We gradually drilled a little bit more until we could almost get to the Schneiderian membrane. We were seeking out the Schneiderian membrane just to see how much we'd gained. We started out with 2 millimeters, and I reached 6.5 millimeters to insert this implant. So we gained in 4 months 4 millimeters in bone height, 100% bone, well mineralized bone, well vascularized bone, and with limited risk. Of course, I could have inserted a 5.5 millimeter implant. We did, as we drilled 6.5 millimeter. We tried to get as far as we could, and then we popped in the bone that we'd harvested apically. So what's happened? Here you can see the implant, which for a final prosthesis, 5.5 millimeter for a single tooth implant is more recommendable than a 4.5 millimeter implant length, because there are far greater versatility of prosthesis. So look at that. We started out with initial heights of 3 millimeters, and we've reached 9 millimeters, and it's all very predictable. So these are our results. Ainsane, come in. I always like to introduce you to my team members, especially those of you who are far away, in countries far away. And so I'd like Ainsane to tell us a little bit more. Ainsane is a maxillofacial surgeon. We work together in the operating theatre, and she's also in charge of training, and she's in charge of all our clinical research. Tell us about the results. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm here to tell you the latest of the latest, those things that actually aren't yet published or are still at the press. By the way, I was looking at the implants, and the tiny extra short implants are tiny. I know in the photos they look huge, they look gigantic, but just remember they're tiny. I've come to talk to you about a study and a clinical trial and a review of the survival rates of these extra short implants. And in how many patients? Over 200. How many implants? Over 300. These are implants that have been placed in molar and premolar regions, that are anchored with multiple prostheses, always splinted, and with survival rates of 97%. That means of the 310 implants that have been inserted, only 8 have failed. And now I'm going to respond to a question which we clinicians always ask ourselves from time to time. In our training department, we organize many courses, Eduardo, and so the question they're going to reply to now is a question that crops up on a daily basis. I use a long implant because if I lose a little bit of bone, I know I've got an implant left. And so I'd like to now ask you the following question. How much bone do we use with these extra short implants? We've carried out a 5 to 8 year review, average of 5 years. And you can see it's irrelevant. What I mean with that is that 0.1 millimeters or 0.2 millimeters of marginal bone loss, for me, it's not bone loss. As you said, always you have to respect biology, drilling properly, slowly. But don't be frightened. If we've followed up this number of implants, we've shown that bone loss is 0.1, 0.2 millimeters. Irrelevant, tiny. Now moving on and finalizing by talking about the extra short implant. We haven't published any yet. What I've just told you about now is at the printers. It's been accepted. It's at the printers. But what can I say to you about the 4.5 millimeter implant? We've got 35 patients, a total of 35 patients with 51 implants in place in their mouths. Of these 51 implants that have been put into place, 37 have already been loaded. They already have their prosthesis, and we don't have, none of them have failed so far. Their response is amazing, as you showed earlier. In fact, some of them have had immediate loading. I should also like to add that the figures that we're giving on bone loss, those 8 cases that I mentioned that suffered from bone loss happened in type 5 bone. So, of course, the type of bone has influence as well as patient hygiene. The results we can see are very surprising. Just to add something to the study that Ainsane mentioned. It was a retrospective study. We're currently in clinical trials. By the way, all the studies are carried out in the clinical trials unit. That means that the evaluators of vertical bone loss are independent people. So they're very severe, they're very tough on us, but marginal bone loss of 0.1, 0.2 is negligible, truly negligible. And our results in these cases with 4.5 millimeters implants are very important. We're talking about limit situations. We're not using 4.5 millimeter implants when we've got bones of 10 millimeters. No, because then we use a 6.5 millimeter implant if we've got 10 millimeters of bone. And we're happy as Larry. Well, it's not that just we're happy as Larry. Let's see whether we're proved right over time. We've spent many years, and we'll see here, because I'm going to give you a few more clinical cases, how independently of the heights that we have. And tomorrow we'll be talking, by the way, about the incidence of all this new information on cases of immediate loading. We are inserting implants of on average 6.5 millimeters long. This is perhaps the average length in our clinical practice today. Sometimes we use the odd one of 7.5 millimeters, but 8.5 millimeters is now extra long as far as we're concerned. We hardly ever use 8.5 millimeter long implants, maybe one a week. The ones that we mainly use are 5.5 or 6.5 millimeters long. Yeah, that's right. So let's move on with our final case, because I don't want this afternoon to stretch on for too long. I think there's quite a lot of information. What's important about this information is the following, that it reaches our patients and that it has direct clinical repercussions. Here we've got one of many patients who's come to our surgery who was told that it was impossible to have implants. He had all of his lower teeth ground down to fit a removable prosthesis. We hardly ever do that nowadays. It's a different matter if you're talking about a crown, a porcelain crown. and we certainly don't want to use prostheses with attaches, because what we're talking about here is how to lose sight of these kinds of prostheses, because we don't like them, nor do our patients, and there's no doubt about that. The biological price that these prostheses pay. Look at the resorption that this patient has and the periodontal situation of all these teeth, which is jeopardized. A removable prosthesis is the best way of shortening the life of our natural teeth. So we first did the wax up, we did the surgical guide, radiographic guide, but let's look at the map. BTI scan gives us a great deal of precision, both of density and amount of residual bone. Here we've got a millimeter, really an extreme situation. Look at the mesial situation, the map of that. And the first premolar, yeah, we could probably have an implant. That's what Einstein was saying. Here, we could insert a 10-millimeter implant, but let's leave it at 6.5. Because this is the typical length that we use. We're not going to use longer implants. And in these rear situations, the treatment that we'll do afterwards is transpose the dental nerve, a technique which nowadays, with the tools that we have available, needs to be demystified and needs to be something used by experienced dentists. On the other side, we've got very reabsorbed crestal bone. We've got 3.7 millimeter crestal bone. We've learned how to use shorter implants, and this is what we're going to do. So let's plan this case. Here, we transpose the dental nerve. We insert our implant. See what I'm trying to show to you? And we've got videos of all of this surgery. I've just had to reduce the amount that I can show you, because this case is one that we could spend all afternoon looking at. But once we've found the nerve, we can just pull it aside, drill quite normally. In this case, what I want to show you is this surgery is possible. If you're an experienced dentist, those of you that have inserted several implants, nowadays these techniques are simpler and easier to use. We had 3 millimeters of residual bone. We put a 4.5 millimeter implant there, so it's slightly supracrestally. So we just drill down using the front cutting drill, 3.5 millimeters, and with a little bit of bone plus from the drill plus a bone that we've got with a bone scraper from the rear area, together with a BRGF clot, will give us this consistency. There's a lot of confusion surrounding all the PRPs today. One of the key issues of using Endurit, why do we use Endurit? Because we can control liberation kinetics, protein liberation kinetics, and at the same time we can control the adhesiveness of the graft. The plasma clots around all the microparticles of the graft. So the graft is sticky. It doesn't need to be pinned there because it's sticky. It's adhesive and it will stick to the residual bone. Nor do I have to carry out any microperforations. The only thing that I've done earlier is just scrape the surface a little bit so that I've got a nice bed to place the graft. On top of that, we'll put the fibrin membrane. And as I showed you earlier, there we've got a millimeter of vertical growth. Very, very predictable. In the maxilla, here we can see the images, again, a very resorbed crestal area. We can put implants in the sinus floor, on the nasal fossa floor, and once again a mini lift. Using techniques in this case, we had delayed loading. Here you can see the expansion in the maxilla with some overcorrection with a sandwich of autologous bone, hydroxapatite, which may be bovine, pig or sheep, then covered with a fibrin membrane. That's our gold standard. Here we can see how the implants evolve in the mandible. Great progress. zero paresthesia. The patient the next day was completely recovered. There are some patients that may take a week or so if there's any swelling to fully recover their sensitivity. But nowadays, we are recovering sensitivity in 100% of cases, and in general, in a very, very short space of time. Here you can see in this extreme end, vertical growth, new bone around these implants. And we're going to load the upper implants here. You can see the gain in all of these implants, the before and the after photos. Look at the overcorrection there. Buccally to gain support, not because we want an overdenture, but because we want a fixed prosthesis. And here you can see how one by one, the different implants evolve, how they've inserted, where we're going to insert the final teeth in the radiographic guide. And with that, we're able to carry out the second surgery. This is how much we gained with the, and here, in the second surgical intervention, you can see how the implants are perfectly situated to follow this bio block concept. We're never going to use the healing abutments, but rather the multi-IM implants. And then the next day you can get the provisionals. We can play with the aesthetics, the labial support. We sometimes, or actually almost always, make a second set of provisionals until we put the teeth where we want them to be, where the patient's happy and where we've got the right aesthetics. So making these provisionals with titanium bars that are articulated, a second set of provisionals here, you can see the aesthetic result. And with the final prosthesis, the only thing that we're going to do here is just duplicate this case, especially when we can play with CAD-CAM, look closely at emergencies. And an impossible case ended up with a fixed prosthesis in maxilla and mandible with a far more conservative way. We've kept the natural teeth, we've removed attached, we've made individual crowns, except in one area we had to create a bridge. And look at all of these short and extra short implants splinted 2 years later, and some, I think, very satisfactory results. So, to conclude today's presentation, today our recommendation is concentrate on core implants. We feel it's the ideal implant for all general dentists, for all those dentists who in the clinical practice don't insert 100 or 150 implants. And for those of you that are more specialists and get involved in more difficult situations, we've got the 3.0 implants. These are far narrower. And we've also got broader implants for worse quality bone. And this is our whole family, implant family. So the 4.5 millimeter implant has been our star today, the star of this presentation, the star of this afternoon. And all I can say is thank you. Thanks to you for attending. We're not going to be able to talk afterwards. Sorry, I have to interrupt you here. Still interesting. It's some interesting content here. So I'm going to please ask you just to stay there. We've got a little bit more to tell you before disappearing off, before scooting off. I'm going to, well, I don't know if you know that we making this tremendous effort to be as close to you as possible. So I want to just very briefly tell you about digital news, our latest digital news. Firstly, we've got a BTI app in Spanish and English with a lot of interesting content translated to all kinds of languages. Exclusive content for you. You can access e-commerce if you're access in the app. So please don't hesitate to visit our app. And we've also got a new website with lots of interesting content. It's also all been translated. And what's really new is that it's very accessible via iPad, your mobile, any device you may have. Social media. Don't forget, visit us. Visit us Instagram, Twitter, And people may ask us, don't you have TikTok? No, we don't, but we probably will be able to do a TikTok. Don't you think it would be great to have a TikTok, sort of a boomerang TikTok with an implant insertion? Imagine, with a bit of music to go with it. Well, we'll do that as well if you want that. But what's even more important before saying goodbye is we've now got a BTI channel. And to tell us about BTI channel, we've got the director of BTI channel, Mr. Pasquale Forenza. Pasquale, when you're ready. Pasquale is this gentleman who's entering to the left of your screen. He looks Italian. That's because he is Italian, and he's got an Italian name. He's a telecoms engineer. He worked at CNBC. You've all heard of CNBC, and he's come here to set us up with a TV channel. This is a television channel. Firstly, thank you so much. I've always been on the other side of the camera, so this is the first time after 5 years that I'm this side of the camera. And also thanks to BTI for having this idea. I'm going to latch onto what you said at the beginning of today's event when you gave your motivational speech. You learned to play the piano, and Eduardo decided to set up a TV channel. Why? Because we've got lots of material. What we just needed to do was to organize it, and that's what we've been doing, organizing it. So it's a TV channel for dentists. Isn't that fun? Isn't that great? If you had to choose between HSBO or Netflix or Amazon Prime Video, no, go to BTI channel. It's far more interesting. Put the family in front of the telly and all learn about implants together. You may be with your boyfriend that's in the evening. You say, what are we going to look? Oh, let's look at a bit of a BTI channel. What about languages? You're Italian, so for the moment we've got 6 channels. I say for the moment because, as you know, we've got Spanish, English, French, German, Portuguese, and in Italian as well. And I say for the moment, because if it was down to Dr. Anitwa, we'd have it Sanskrit and Aramaic, but we're having difficulty in finding people to do that for us. But anyway, we'll see how we can organize it. What sort of content are we going to find? There's going to be 2 main areas. One for industry professionals, and there you've got videos on implant dentistry, oral surgery, another part on regenerative medicine, the uses that can be made of PRGF in other fields, such as traumatology, ophthalmology, another section on sleep disorders, which explain the use of the apnea apparatus that BTI have created, and then sections a little bit more accessible for those of us that aren't doctors, because we also want to up our knowledge. And there's a section called The Expert Gives You Opinion, and there are several experts, including Dr. Anita, will give us advice on nutrition, breathing, meditation, general health advice, such as how to clean your teeth, what peri-implantitis is like, well, explained for dummies, peri-implantitis for dummies, as it were, and that's all. What's great about this channel is it's a channel that's continually updating. We're going to add things to it as much as we can. There are many videos that are already available in more than one language because they've been translated, and that's to be closer to all our friends. There's something that I always like. I like this idea of a channel, but what I'd like is a competition. Instead of who wants to be a dentist, where myself or Dr. Anita present it, and we ask questions, and at the end, whoever wins gets an implant kit to take home with them. Yeah, maybe I wouldn't mind taking part in this kind of thing because I'm getting a handle on it. So I can't promise you anything, but I might be able to get the first 2 or 3 questions right. Thank you so much, Pasquale, for having spent time with us, for having introduced us to this BTI channel, and I'm going to say goodbye. And I'm going to do that, ask for Dr. Anitwa to come back and help us say goodbye. We've reached the end of day 1. Very interesting day. What I really enjoyed of everything that I've seen was this fibroblast. You know, he was lying around sunbathing, and the others were sort of rolled up tight. These hemidesmosomes, getting a good microscopic image of them is by no means easy, because science isn't easy, but at the same time, it's quite clear, it's fascinating, and it opens our eyes. So the only thing that I try to do here is to get information across to you. There's still a afternoon ahead of us. So thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks to the team behind the cameras. It would have been nice to be able to show you who's behind the camera. Just to give you an idea, there are 3,000 people in the technical room behind you, but you can't see them, but they're there. This is like a football stadium. No. If it was there were 3,000 people here, we'd have the police outside for not respecting social distancing. No, but there is a major team behind us, so it's for you. We dedicate this to you. Thanks to Carlos, but I don't want to leave anybody out. So Raúl as well, the other Carlos, to the team that's been behind the organization of this event, the management, there's more. So, yeah, but tomorrow we'll thank you again. Don't worry. Tomorrow we've got another session which you cannot miss. So if you like this one, and I know you did, tomorrow be back, stuck in front of your computer, because it's going to be great content. More tomorrow. I don't think it'll be more. So see you tomorrow. Good afternoon.